One of my earliest gaming memories when I was a kid was the Christmas I got a Nintendo Game Boy. I remember unboxing game after game and stacks of accessories like the light attachment, screen magnifier and power charger to save those all too expensive batteries. Despite having games like Batman, Robocop, Soccer, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Mario Land, the one which definitely got me addicted even at that young age was Tetris. Like the rest of the UK, or in fact world would be precise, when Tetris was combined with the Game Boy, you had a setup which transcended entertainment forms, and even those who weren't typical video game players would suddenly be glued to their screens. I vividly remember getting on the tube as I lived in London at the time and taking my Game Boy with me, and there being many other people happily playing their Game Boys during their journeys. You've got to remember that seeing people with their eyes fixed to a screen is a commonplace now with smartphones and so on, but back then it was something quite surreal. Tetris Fever was also something which my parents got into, and I remember them vividly playing the game too. I would rarely see my mum playing video games, and apart from an obscure game called Jungle Gym which was on the Amiga, I can't think of a time when I saw her playing video games in this way. Of course, what happened as the years went by is that more and more Tetris games would be released on any system it could be pushed onto. Some would go down the pure classic route of Tetris, offering little more than new visuals for the classic formula. Others would try their hand to either reinvent the game or possibly make subtle changes to breathe new life into the game. When it came to the Nintendo 64, there were 4 Tetris games released on the system during its lifespan. So for today's episode, we're taking a look at those 4 games to see what they did with the core game, and how they attempted to differentiate themselves from one another in what could have been a very small, crowded market. As always though, if you want a full review of any of these games covered in today's episode, then head on down to the description box and I'll link you up to the reviews I've done over the years. And for today's topic of conversation in the comments box down below, let's hear everybody's first memory of when they played Tetris. I'm sure with the wide range of ages we have here, as well as people from all over the world, there'll be some really cool, unique stories to share here. Starting with perhaps the most bright and colourful version of Tetris comes Disney's Magical Tetris Challenge. What makes this one interesting right off the bat is this was Capcom's first Nintendo 64 release, and it landed on store shelves in late '98 in Japan and the following year worldwide. Back in the day, I remember the N64 community, we'd been waiting for Capcom's first move on the console, and after many teased games like Street Fighter, we got severely annoyed that their first big debut on the console was a Tetris game. Once I got past that annoyance however, Magical Tetris Challenge is actually quite an interesting release. What makes this game magical, you ask? Well, aside from the Disney license which gave us the likes of Mickey, Minnie and Donald in the game, there's a wide range of game styles to play here. Off the bat, I'd recommend hitting the storyline mode, which sees you pick one of 4 playable characters who each have their own storyline to progress through. Now I say storyline loosely because there's very little reason why the characters are using Tetris at various points in the storyline, but I think it does help to keep things interesting. You can also play this under standard mode or upside down mode, which takes, like the name suggests, Tetris but turning things upside down so that the blocks rise upwards instead of falling down. When you first play this mode it can be incredibly disorientating, especially if you're accustomed to the traditional falling blocks, and so it adds an extra difficulty for anyone who thinks they're already a master. The game gets its magical name from what happens during gameplay. You have your standard 7 Tetris pieces, but what makes things action-packed is you're working hard to send unusual shaped pieces over to your opponent's field by clearing lines. These can be extra large pieces, or ones with unusual shapes, and they really cause problems. Be cautious however, as your opponent can also attack you with the same force, and so what you'll quickly find here is that being able to play the game quickly is key if you want to be able to attack more often. With the meter building up, it also offers you some respite from the non-stop action by running a magical finger over the playing field with a rainbow pattern, and bang, anything above it disappears, which can really take the pressure off at the right moment. There's also the ability to lock in a very cool move here however. As the game has magical pieces which can be up to 5x5 in size, it is possible during game at rare moments to create a 5-line section called a pentris. I really like the presentation here, the graphics are nice and clear, the character animations, whilst limited, do a good job of portraying the characters' emotions, and the storyline cutscenes work well in the context of the game. The music here is decent quality, and as expected it's typically upbeat and cheery tunes to play along to. When playing, you can easily block it out and then focus and concentrate on what's on screen, so it doesn't become distracting, which I think is a big plus for any Tetris game. Overall, this is one of the most enjoyable Tetris games on the system. It's fairly easy to find, and the fact that I can still play Tetris all these years later means that there's also a lot of longevity. There's multiplayer support, tons of other game modes, and there's also a lot to get stuck into, so this one definitely comes recommended from me. Jumping across the ocean now to Japan with Tetris 64, which was a Japanese exclusive release. I have no idea why this never left Japan, as all of the text in the game is in English, which makes it one of the easiest Japanese exclusive games to play for a Westerner, but perhaps one of the hardest for Japanese speakers to play. Insanity aside, this one was developed by Amtex and published by Sata in November of 1998. The game most of the time was sold with the BIO sensor, which was a pack-in, although they did sell a small number of the BIO sensors on their own, I guess for anyone who happened to break theirs. But what is a BIO sensor, you ask? Well, for anyone not in the know, the BIO sensor was an attachment for the N64, which only works with this game. But I can think of so many other games that could have made good use of it, that it really baffles me in the mind that it never became more adopted. The BIO sensor would plug into the memory card slot of your controller, and with a clip, you'd attach it to your ear and it would detect your pulse and alter the game accordingly. In this particular game, it would have a special game mode called BIO TETRIS, which would change the speed of the game depending on how fast or how slow your heart rate was going. Famitsu scored the game 27 out of 40, and the biggest criticism of it at the time was that compared to the other Tetris games already out on the system, this one was visually dull. My biggest complaint, however, is that the BIO sensor is a complete gimmick. When playing in the BIO Tetris mode, you'd either need to be dropping dead or chugging pints of energy drink to get any kind of realistic change in the game from this attachment. If you take the BIO Tetris mode out of the equation, then the game is quite limited. There is multiplayer support, so if you want a pure Tetris experience with friends, then this is a good shout. There's also the Giga Tetris mode, which sees giant Tetris pieces thrown into the mix. Again, however, I found this to be more of a gimmick than an actual fun new way to play the game. Visually, I'd agree with Famitsu's comments. The background wallpapers on the screen are super low quality, and to be honest, they look like a stock set of low-res wallpapers the studio probably purchased at a discount. They have little to do with the game, and some of them are broken into tiles with thick lines, which is really distracting. The music is dreadful. They went for a chirpy, upbeat soundtrack, which makes sense, but it has some big pitch swings when playing, which will grate your ears. The music itself is super low quality and sounds heavily distorted and muffled. I played games on my Amiga 500 years before this which sounded clearer, and so I have no idea what the studio was thinking here. This one gets a bigger void from me. It has its moments, and it's cool to check out the BIO mode if you can borrow a sensor, but seeking this out to play the game mode isn't worth the high cost they tend to go for in the secondary market like eBay. Take my advice and just play one of the other games on this list that we're going to be doing here. Perhaps the most unique of the Tetris games on the console comes Tetrisphere, developed by H2O and published by Nintendo. The fact Nintendo published this one should say a lot about it, as this game was originally being developed as an early Atari Jaguar game, but after Nintendo saw its unique gameplay, they snapped up the rights and began to rework it as an upgrade for the N64. Tetrisphere is one of those games which is hard as balls to explain to someone, and it works much better just to give someone the controller and let them do the tutorial. In short, the classic Tetris rulebook is thrown out, and instead you have a spherical ball covered in blocks which you're working to clear here. The aim is to drop pieces onto the sphere in order to create matching sets which will be removed, thus peeling back the sphere like an onion with multiple layers. You're up against the clock here, as if you take too long to find a block to cause a chain reaction with, you'll automatically drop the block wherever you're looking at, and you'll more than likely pick up a penalty. The mode I personally love the most is the rescue mode, which sees a little robot trapped inside the sphere, and each level you need to work more and more quickly, as well as take off more and more layers to free him from the inside sphere. The game's incredibly addictive, and the visuals are superb in my opinion, although simplistic. I love the many different game modes which are packed in, including support for up to 2 players, and the slight variations in each game mode do just enough to make the game challenging without moving too far away from the basic formula of the concept. It would be rude not to mention the awesome soundtrack here, as it's one of the better ones on the console overall. Composed by Neil Voss, it went on to win Nintendo Power's award for Best Soundtrack that year. And it's a cool mix of electronic sounds with many samples being used in its creation. It's actually one of the rare occasions when playing a puzzle game that I've wanted to hear the music blasting out when playing, as it's just so unique and has some fantastic elements to it, and it complements the game rather than detracting from what you should be focusing on. The soundtrack features over an hour of original music, and to take my word, it's actually worth loading it up on YouTube and having a listen to. I'm going to keep things brief for this game because in all honesty I want more people to just go out and try this one. It's super cheap to pick up, it was the first puzzle game released on Nintendo 64 and it set the bar incredibly high. Its production costs were fairly low and it went on to make a really good return for Nintendo from sales figures. It's a game which many people who've played have been waiting for a sequel for years now, but for the time being just head out and play this one because there's really not much else like it. After the success of Tetrisphere, whatever did the studio do next? Well, here's your answer. Another Tetris game. This time it's called the New Tetris, and this time around it's a more traditional version when compared to their first N64 game. This one was yet again published by Nintendo, and before I go any further, the fantastic Neil Voss returned with a brand new soundtrack, and yet again he smashed this one out of the park. As soon as you turn on the game, you're greeted by his modern interpretation of the classic Tetris theme song, this time throwing in accordions amongst many other instruments to make something which sounds refreshingly new, whilst at the same time incredibly nostalgic. The rest of the soundtrack is yet again another masterpiece of electronic music on the console. It's super fresh, original, and the quality is clear, which is a big plus. Like Tetrisphere, you should go listen to the full soundtrack on YouTube when you're done, as it's worth checking out for sure. Onto the game then, and before I go into the gameplay I want to give a big highlight to the cool real-time rendered scenes that are thrown into the game. To do this resolution in real time on the N64 hardware is a big accomplishment, and the 3D flybys of world monuments and landmarks is a unique thing to see here. That aside, the gameplay is very solid, but there are a few little things here which I found annoying in this one. Now it could just be me, but I tend to like to drop blocks quickly and then stop and adjust them at the last moment. Here there seems to be a strange momentum when it comes to blocks falling, and so this was very difficult for me to do. Now I know most people don't play this way, so it could just be a quirk for myself, so don't let that one put you off this. The new Tetris gameplay is fine though. I love the backgrounds based off monuments, and there's some nice lighting effects that bring them to life, and it gives the game a really nice level of polish to look at. As you play through the game, you'll unlock wonders of the world by completing lines in the game, but be warned that to unlock the highest level, which is Russia, you need to do over 500,000 lines in the game, so only the most die-hard fans are ever likely to see everything that this game has to offer. The game is sometimes most famous though for the secret rant which the lead programmer put into the game's code, which right after the game's release was hacked and released and made publicly available. I cover this in more detail in the review I did of the game, but it's quite funny and yet shows how naive someone can be to think it wouldn't get found. Or maybe he wanted it to be. We'll never know exactly because sadly he passed away in 2001. He died whilst at home listening to music and playing a video game according to his family, and he'd been complaining of bronchial asthma for weeks and that was eventually what killed him. This must have been a huge shock to his family given how young he was. His family later said that his rant was never intended to be found, but he did it for a little bit of immortality in terms of the game, and when it was leaked so quickly, he got in quite a lot of trouble with Nintendo for it. With him only being 29 years old, it was an early exit for such a talented programmer, but the biggest tribute of all is perhaps the fact that over 2 decades later we're still talking about his work. In the game though, I like the fact that you could switch pieces in your holding area when playing, which makes creating new lines easier. And I don't know what the technical or Tetris scene term for this is, and I've heard it called wall kicking in the past, but it's where you can rotate a piece directly against the wall, which helps you make last minute lines with some split second rotations. I don't know exactly what it's called as I mentioned, but I'm sure people here will understand what I mean. And it's something which makes this game 10 times more playable than some of the other Tetris games I've played over the years. All in all though, this one's a solid game. It's familiar enough to have some nostalgia inducing moments, and yet unique enough to still feel fresh. With some great music, quality visuals and good multiplayer modes, this one should be another game for everybody's collection. So there you have it, there's my roundup of the 4 Tetris games on the console. There's nothing more infuriating than watching somebody else play Tetris because it's easy to spot somebody else's mistakes, and so if you're still here then you must have patience of a saint. But as always, thank you for watching, and until next time.